Good day, everybody. So, what I wanted to do in this video was just simply talk about one of Milton's prose works. He had many of those, and I do recommend those to you for understanding his just the way he thinks about things and some of his beliefs greater. But one of the ones I really want to talk about the most actually was his 1644 treatise of education. So this lays out basically Milton's philosophy of education, and um, he really lays out like an education plan for basically like what he think the ideal education should be specifically for somebody about ages 12 to 21. That's really the ideal time frame he's working with for when focused intense education of grammar, logic, rhetoric, basically all of the seven main liberal arts, as well as actually studying great works of literature, scripture, church history, all of that stuff. He wants that all to take place throughout that time of somebody's life. And so what he's doing here is really like laying out that education plan. One thing that you can do here as well is on the Dartmouth.edu reading room for Milton, which I do have linked in the course syllabus. You can read this whole thing there. It's pretty short. If it was like on the average paperback book, it would be maybe like 6 or 7 pages. So very readable. It's accessible, really interesting. I recommend you read it for yourself. But I did want to read a passage from this real quick before we begin. So this is what Milton has to say. The end, then, of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the nearest by possessing our souls of true virtue, which being united to the heavenly grace of faith makes up the highest perfection. So this is the telos, or the end of Milton's education. This is what he thinks somebody should be educated for. It's ultimately about conformity to, it's Aristotelian in a sense, right? We're educated to conform to the good. Aristotle and Plato and other philosophers were right on that, but because of lack of just special revelation at the time, one thing they did not understand was that the good was the Christian God. And though I personally believe that as well as a Christian, I'm not putting my own words in there, but this is exactly what Milton was getting at. And you can see that in his own words. Milton being a Christian, he was raised Puritan. He did deviate from Puritanism in some ways, not every way, throughout his life. He certainly wrestled with a lot of theology, but that was the end for him. It was really repairing the ruins of what was lost in the fall. And there's so much that comes with that, but think one of the products of the fall was that especially we see this in Genesis 10 and 11 with the Tower of Babel, is there's a loss of language at the end of the day. There's a loss of a unified language, specifically, is what I mean by that. And because of that, language learning is now something that we have to labor and toil at, to study and learn good grammar, which most people just don't naturally enjoy that. If you do, more power to you. But there's a real labor and toil just to understand one's own language, but especially learning other languages of other cultures. And Milton did believe that was necessary. And there's another part in the treatise where I don't have the quote exactly pulled up at this moment, but he basically says that we should spend our language learning efforts focused on the things, focus on the places where we can glean the most wisdom from. So for Milton, the main ones there were obviously English, in a sense, as he's part of the great English literary tradition, but his three main ones outside of the English vernacular for English-speaking people are going to be Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And the Hebrew is going to come out of Milton being this is all in a combination of Milton being a Christian humanist, so coming out of that Renaissance movement of humanism, and specifically Christian humanism, Christians who are lovers of the humanities and see truth, goodness, beauty, and wisdom in all of those things. Milton is certainly going to, that's why he's going to pick these three languages in a way. And the Hebrew especially is going to come out of his Christian background. Milton loved the Old Testament. You'll see direct quotes and references and implicit references and allusions to the Old Testament all over Paradise Lost. I mean, considering this takes place within the bounds of mostly the Genesis 1 to 3 poetry and scripture, that's going to be all over the place, right? So that shouldn't be a surprise. But he's going to reference the rest of the Old Testament too, not merely just Genesis 1 to 3 or Genesis per se. But Latin and Greek, he did believe there was value to be gleaned there. This is very, Lewisian in a sense, where C.S. Lewis believed that, there was great things to be gleaned from the best of paganism, but that Christianity completed it and fulfilled it in a sense. That there's, these shadows of the Logos, these shadows of Christ that we see all through the philosophical and literary traditions of Greece and Rome, and that they're, in a sense, preparing the way for when Christ would become incarnate and be physically revealed to man, just God being revealed to man in the flesh in that way through that hypostatic union. So that's basically why Milton's going to see these three languages as the most important. He will like recommend other languages here and there if you actually read the treatise, but those are going to be his three things, and he's going to basically say like focus all your efforts on learning those so that you open up the doorways to be able to read all of the great Latin, Greek, and the Hebrew Old Testament, all the great works of those cultures in their original tongue, so that you can properly understand them, because there's only so much you can understand and are limited to even if you read the best of translations, right? That's certainly like a classical way of thinking, and that's just how they would have thought an educated person would have thought of it in Milton's 17th century world. So enough about that. Again, read it for yourself. This is a topic that's very worth discussing and reading into, but I want to lay out the education plan that he has for you, and this is what the bulk of this treatise is going to be, him just going systematically through basically where a child should start, where they should work through, and where they should end their education at. So, beginning study at age 12, and they should engage with a complete and generous education. That's a direct quote from Milton. And what he means by that is basically a very well-rounded liberal arts education. For those of you who don't have a background in classics or liberal arts or classical education, a liberal arts education is going to include basically the best of mathematics, natural sciences, philosophy, literature, music, all of those things. I mean, the trivium is grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium is astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. So basically encompassing those things, plus other things at this time, because the Renaissance did in some way move beyond just the mere trivium and quadrivium of the Middle Ages. Like including things like history and other subjects, which he's going to actually be very Renaissance in that way, where the study of history as a subject and discipline in of itself is going to come out in Milton a lot. You'll see that in the character Raphael, especially in the poem, as he is, in some ways, Adam's teacher in the middle of the poem. So Milton wanted there to be a heavy grammar stage at the beginning. He basically said, don't waste any time at this, very ripe season of one's youth, where they have the proper ability and time and energy and brain faculties or mental rational faculties to really develop and learn good grammar that's going to set them up for success for the rest of their education and the rest of their life. From there, he recommended that they read Cicero, Plutarch, Plato, and Quintilian, just to kind of see just how grammar played out in different writings of the Greco-Roman tradition. Another thing, I mentioned the quadrivium earlier, and Milton's going to be really critical of what he calls the scholastic grossness of the medieval university system. Milton was certainly in some ways pretty against, some of the things of the High Middle Ages. He was certainly a pretty avid opponent of the Roman Catholic Church in a lot of ways of his time. That's very nuanced. There's still things that they would have had in common, of course, and I'm not going to parse that out here and there, but one of his problem here specifically that he cites in the treatise was that there's too heavy of an emphasis on basically abstract metaphysics and high philosophical concepts at way too young of an age. He thinks they should be learning building block and foundational things at this age, and that they can focus on philosophy and robust metaphysics and all of that later on, which I think he's totally right on that personally. Um, Another component he really emphasized here was putting a very developing and cultivating a love of learning for the sake of learning and curiosity in of themselves. So he's really trying to get the youth to love learning and cultivate a love of learning and great books and great literature, great philosophy, poetry, and all that very early on. So that's one of his goals. You see that in the classical education world today, and I think that differentiates classical educators like myself from not all, but a lot of people in the public education system, where they don't even really think about trying to cultivate and create lifelong learners in their system. Milton's very much he's very much an advocate for that, and he makes that clear. Amongst those things, and learning just the building blocks of those, learning the basics of the seven liberal arts. Milton also wants these students to have a rich devotional and scriptural life and a good biblical theological education. So this is definitely coming very much out of Puritanism. I'm not saying that's specifically where he gleaned this from, but growing up as a Puritan, he would have been required to participate with his mother and father in regular family worship in the evenings. The Puritans were very big about every evening a family should, or morning, or whenever they can make the time, a family should get together at least once a day and pray, read some scripture, and sing a hymn. So there's certainly an influence there, I think. And that's part of his educational prescription, which, again, I am very double thumbs up pro that. I think that's a wonderful thing. The younger will learn the story of scripture in this time, and the older are to basically build off of those, simple, like, Sunday school story kind of lessons, and to start learning theology, start learning both patristic and medieval church history, as well as modern church history, which, of course, would only take them up to about the 1640s when Milton wrote this. But he wanted them to learn everything. He wanted them to learn from the Old Testament, New Testament, to the Church Fathers, all the way through the Reformation into his own time. And he also recommended that this is the time where they would be learning some Hebrew as well, was throughout their devotional life and their time of biblical theological studies as well. So super cool. We see that a lot in like the classical education movement today. Though Hebrew isn't usually included in the curriculum, it certainly could be. And Milton likely very much learned Hebrew growing up as well. He was certainly a master of it for most of his life. From there, he would move on to pastoral poetry, which would basically just be like agrarian poetry. Poetry, think of like Wendell Berry in our time with his poetry, right? This is it's very like agrarian focused, very much emphasizing the beauty of the country mouse life versus the city mouse. So you're going to see he recommends Cato, Varro, and Columella for this specific portion, just agrarian poetry of the classical world. From there, he recommended that they move on to geography, continuing learning Latin and learning Greek beyond Latin. I'm not sure if he exactly wanted them to learn Latin or Greek at the same time, or Latin first and Greek later. I think Latin is absolutely easier to learn for an English speaker, and it kind of serves as a good via media or pathway into Greek, as it's it borrows a lot of things from Greek, but is similar to English in other ways, especially some of our vocabulary. But nevertheless, he wanted them to learn both, and he was very clear about that. And early on, too, not like when they're like 18 or 20, but when they're like 12 or 13, so that they can be reading those great works in the original tongue for the rest of their education. From there, he recommended learning trigonometry, architecture, engineering, and navigation. So there's a level of there's a practical aspect to this too, where it's like engineering and navigation as well were included in his curriculum, not just pure mathematics, not just like a STEM field, but he wanted them to be able to learn practical matters. And he even went as far to say they should spend time learning from master hunters, fowlers, fishermen, shepherds, and gardeners as well. He wanted them to be getting their hands dirty, getting in there, learning how to build stuff, learning how to fix stuff, learning how to fish and hunt, and learning all the practical matters as well. So it's really not just a math and humanities well-rounded education, but even a tradesman education. I mean, could you imagine that today, like learning math, learning languages, learning literature, philosophy, and history, and also like learning how to fix things, and maybe even like build ships or something, learning how to fish, learning how to hunt, um, learning how to tend to sheep and take care of farm animals, those such things, learning how to take care of and tend to plants. Right. I think that's fascinating. I wish there was I wish even our classical education system today could find a way to incorporate that more, and maybe they will. If there was an opportunity for that, I would certainly vote for it. I know that much. As far as poetry goes, they would move on to that after all of this. And so the poets he's going to emphasize are Orpheus, Hesiod, Theocritus, Lucretius, Menelaus, and then some of Virgil's more agrarian works. So two main works I could think of here would be Hesiod's work in Days. That's the same guy who wrote Theogony, which is like our main source of early Greek mythology. And then Virgil, of course, a man who needs no introduction, the author of the Aeneid. He wrote a work called Gorgias, around during his life. I'm not exactly sure when off the top of my head, but that's one of his more agrarian works, right? The Romans loved practical matters. They loved agrarian focused literature in a lot of ways, and Virgil most certainly did write his own agrarian work, and that's one that Milton highly recommended. So in the next phase, they're going to be shifting into a deep focus on ethics. So they've laid the building blocks, and now it's time to actually learn what is the good life and how to be virtuous. The emphasis was to know and love virtue and to know and hate vice. That was sort of like at the center of his ethics. Very Aristotelian, of course, very, very much Platonic in plenty of ways too. Just since Aristotle wrote Nicomachean Ethics and it was so influential, that's mainly where I'm citing Aristotle there. But in this time, he was going to have him read Plato, read Xenophon, read Cicero, read Plutarch, who wrote the Lives series, other philosophical works as well. But he wrote the biographies on different Greek and Roman figures with the emphasis of pointing out and parsing out the virtue and vice in their lives for students to learn from in a story form. So after all that, he believed they were prepared to study economics, drama, and politics, then to study law after that, seeing the Torah as the greatest law, right? So Genesis through Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. Along with that, he also had him read Lycurgus, the man who came up with the Spartan Constitution, and then, of course, Emperor Justinian, who codified the Roman Byzantine law a couple centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He talks specifically about Sundays. I imagine this is also part of his Puritan upbringing, as he probably had I don't know this for sure, that's why I'm saying probably, but I would intuit that he likely gleaned a very Sabbatarian view of Sundays from his Puritan upbringing. Certainly many of the Reformed tradition have this view of covenantal theology, where the Sabbath continues on into the New Covenant, and therefore Sundays are to be, in a sense, Sabbatarian. That's a complex subject I'm not going to comment on here, but in some ways I'm sure Milton was influenced by that from his Puritan upbringing. And he thought Sundays were supposed to be spent not just going to church, but also studying sound doctrinal theology and church history, kind of like just with like the family devotional time as well. I think this is a great thing. I think Christians should spend time on Sunday doing these things as well. Not gonna give my opinions on the Sabbath and all of that, but there's certainly, whether you agree with it or not, there's many good things that could be gleaned from Milton here as well. So they'd also, in the stage of focusing on ethics and learning economics and drama and all these other things, they would also start to learn rhetoric, which was towards the end of the education system. Now that they have all these building blocks, it was time to learn how to write well and to write strong, convincing arguments in beautiful prose and poetry. And to do that, they would read Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Longinus, all very famous rhetorically inclined figures from the Greco-Roman world. From there, they would move on to more advanced poetry. They'd read, of course, Aristotle's Poetics, one of the most influential works of classical poetry, maybe the most influential work on kind of like the philosophy of literature and poetry of that time. And of course, they'd read the great Roman Epicurean poet Horace. And first, this was to show what's glorious and magnificent, and what human and divine things may be used and expressed through the means of poetry versus prose. And of course, Milton wrote Paradise Lost, Samson Agonistes, and Paradise Regained at the end of his life, and you're certainly going to see that influence there as he says in Paradise Lost, as he's trying to justify the ways of God to men through his poem. So that's the influence there. And so, along with all this education, like the intellectual side of it, he also believed that exercise and physical training should be a part of the education system as well. Another thing I am absolutely 100% on board with. So he said an hour and a half midday, there should be time for exercise, eating, probably like a lunch break or something like that in his time, and getting the appropriate rest. So resting to prepare for the mental and or physical labors of the afternoon as well. Part of the physical training was he recommended martial arts training, both in times of war and in times of peace, because unfortunately, part of the fall, war is inevitable, and he believed that men needed to know how to fight and help defend their country, which was, I think, really excellent in a lot of ways. It helps them. He believed this helped them to develop the virtue of fortitude, or the cardinal virtue of fortitude or courage. So basically, just one being able to have the right balance between being bold and courageous, but also not being foolish about it. And he believed this helped them to develop resilience and toughness, which I think he's totally right on. Wrestling was a part of that curriculum, very Greco-Roman inspired, of course. I would certainly not be mad about it if wrestling was part of a curriculum as well. I think classical schools should at least try to have like a wrestling team or something, because I think it's good to have at the end of the day. I think there's a lot you learn from that. I have a background in grappling myself. I'm not a great wrestler, but I have a background in grappling, and there are many benefits that I have gleaned from that as well. So another thing I would totally support. Beyond that, he believed in, along with exercise, he also believed in a perpetual studying and appreciation of music. I myself have played guitar for most of my life, and I played trumpet as a kid and enjoyed music theory and all sorts of different kinds of music, so I am on board with that as well. And music was viewed as, especially in the Middle Ages, it was viewed as an essential part of one's proper education, so Milton's certainly in that tradition as well, in a sense. After completing one's education through into young adulthood, Milton did recommend a 2 to 3 years studying abroad, basically in their early mid 20s, so like 23, 20, 24, 25. He believed basically that once you've mastered your own English vernacular tradition, and you've mastered the Greco-Roman tradition and the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, that one should move abroad and start exploring continental Europe and gleaning from the Italians and the French and all the great literary works that can be explored on the continent of Europe. And Milton did this in his own life. After he graduated from Cambridge with both his bachelor's and his master's degree, 2 years after the bachelor's degree, he actually spent a few years in Europe as well. He was dissatisfied in some ways with his education at Cambridge. I'll get into that in the more biographical video that I'm going to make, but Milton certainly encouraged people to do this if they could have this. By the way, this plan in this time would have required just a ton of money, so don't feel bad if your education wasn't anything like this. Mine wasn't either, nor was most people in Milton's time. You had to basically come from wealth and aristocracy to have this kind of education, and I'm assuming that's probably his target audience here at the end of the day. And along with that, last but not least, another thing I agree with here is that Milton believed in having a healthy and moderate diet here. So Milton, like he should, believed that nutrition was also important to fueling the mind, fueling the body, preparing one for the day's labors, both intellectual and physical. And so he was going to say that having a good, strong and nutritional diet was important. And also, in the classical tradition, one of the cardinal virtues is temperance, which is basically self-control. So, like any classical philosopher or figure, Milton would have certainly encouraged one to know how to eat well without gorging oneself or just eating bad food, being a slave to the appetites, right? Again, being a man with a chest in, C.S. Lewis's terms, An Abolition of Man, right? Like where the chest connects the belly, the appetite, and the reason, the head. Um, so being one who's connected there, where they're not just a brain on a stick and they're not just a slave to their appetites, but one who is using, logic and reason in their education to govern and properly assess the pleasures and the appetites of this world. So that's all going to tie in there. Um, but that's pretty much it. Again, I highly recommend that you read this educational treatise for yourself. It is remarkable. It's profound. It's probably very different for what most of you were educated on growing up, including myself, unfortunately a student of the state of Michigan's public education system growing up, not classically educated until I was much older. I think it's really insightful and interesting to read, and I certainly hope you enjoyed my comments on it as well. And I hope this video is helpful to you as we engage in further study of Milton through the rest of the semester. Thanks. God bless.